Hello, welcome. If these stories speak to you, if you find comfort in the lessons found in the dark corners of history, please check if you're following the show. It helps more than you know, helping new viewers find us and helping me to make better videos for you all. Here's something the world rarely says out loud. The greatest fortunes in human history were not built by the people who worked the hardest. They were built by the people who read the rules most carefully and bent them. Welcome, Midnight Magnates. This is Mr. Calder. As the world goes quiet, we step into the shadows to uncover the stories that built our world. If you enjoy listening or falling asleep to the hidden history of power, fortunes made, and the human nature behind the price of greatness, then this is the place for you. Picture a cold evening in Cleveland, sometime in the early 1870s. The air is thick with the smell of kerosene and coal smoke, and the river. And on a railway siding by lamplight, a single barrel of crude oil is being loaded onto a freight car bound for market. The man watching it go is a small refiner, an independent, one of dozens of ordinary men who borrowed and scraped and bet everything they had on this oil boom, and who now lie awake at night running the same arithmetic over and over, counting the thin handful of pennies that stand between them and ruin. He pays the railroad 80 cents to carry that barrel, a published rate. A fair rate, he believes. The same rate, surely, that every man on this siding pays. He has to believe that. The fairness of it is the only thing holding his small world together. But it is not fair. It was never fair. Because somewhere across town, in a quiet office he will never be invited into, an arrangement has been made that he will never be told about. Of the 80 cents he just paid to ship his own oil, 40 of them, fully half, will be quietly lifted back out of the railroad's hand and slipped to his largest competitor, the very rival who is working patiently to bankrupt him. Every barrel this man ships now makes the man destroying him a little richer. He is paying with his own two hands for the rope that will hang his business, and his name appears nowhere on the receipt. Sit with that for a moment in the dark. Because the part that should chill you is not the cruelty of it. It is this. No law has been broken. No safe has been cracked. No lock picked. No lie told to anyone's face. There is nothing here that a court in this year could so much as touch. This is simply a gap, a seam between what the rules say and what the rules are able to stop. And one soft-spoken, church-going, penny-counting bookkeeper has noticed that seam when every other man on that siding looked straight at it and saw nothing at all. And he will not stop at one barrel. He will not stop at one rival, or one city, or one railroad. By the time this quiet man is finished, he will hold 9 out of every 10 barrels of oil in the United States of America in the palm of his hand. He will become, by some measures, the richest human being the modern world has ever produced. And the law that was meant to stop him will need 40 years and the Supreme Court of the United States itself simply to understand what it was he had done. His name we will come to we have a long way to travel first. 2,000 years, in fact, and a great deal of money across empires and churches and trading floors on the far side of the earth. Because this man's trick was only one of 9, and every single one of them lived in the very same place. That quiet gap in the wall of the world that everyone walks past and almost no one ever sees. To understand the first of our 9, you have to understand the city he lived in. Not the marble Rome of the postcards, the columns, the togas, the senators carved into history. Forget all of that. Picture instead the Rome that almost no one painted. The Rome at night. It was a city stacked on top of itself. Hundreds of thousands of people crammed into tenement blocks the Romans called insulae, islands. 5, 6, 7 stories of timber and mud brick, leaning over narrow streets, packed so tightly that the upper floors nearly touched across the alley. Inside, people cooked over open flames. They lit oil lamps against the dark, and the whole thing was essentially kindling. So Rome burned. Not occasionally, constantly. Fires broke out somewhere in the city most nights, and buildings didn't just catch. They collapsed. They pancaked. They took the families inside them down into the rubble. And here is the part that's hard for a modern mind to hold. The part you should sit with for a moment in the quiet. There was no fire department. None. No brigade to call. No hose. No help on the way. Rome's first public firefighting force, the Vigiles, would not exist until the reign of Augustus, decades after the man we're discussing was dead. In Crassus's lifetime, when your building caught fire in the night, you stood in the street and you watched everything you owned turn to ash and smoke. There was no insurance to make you whole. There was no one to call. You simply lost it all. Now, most people looking at a city like that feel one of 2 things: pity or fear. They see ruin. One man looked at exactly the same thing, the same flames, the same screaming, the same families standing in the street with nothing, and he saw a market that no one was serving. A patient, watchful, cold-eyed patrician named Marcus Licinius Crassus. The historian Plutarch, writing more than a century later, would render his verdict on Crassus in a single devastating line. The man, he said, made the public calamities his greatest source of revenue. He didn't pray for the fires to stop. He looked at the burning city, and he did something no one else had thought to do. He bought 500 men who could put the fires out. And then he decided he would be the only man in Rome who could. Here is how the machine worked, and I want to be precise about it because the truth is stranger and quieter than the version you may have heard. Crassus bought slaves. Specifically, and this is the genius of it, he bought slaves who were architects and builders, skilled men, until he owned more than 500 of them. A private workforce. The largest concentration of construction and firefighting labor in the city, and it belonged entirely to him. Then he waited for a fire. And when one came, he went to the owner of the burning house and to the owners of the houses next to it, the ones the flames hadn't reached yet, but soon would. And he made them an offer. Plutarch's words for what happened next are exact, and I'll give them to you as he wrote them. The terrified owners, he says, let go at a trifling price, owing to their fear and uncertainty. A trifling price, owing to their fear and uncertainty. Now, I should pause here because there's a famous version of this story, and it isn't quite true. You may have heard that Crassus stood in the street and haggled over the price while the building was still on fire, refusing to send his men in to fight the flames until the deal was signed. It's a vivid scene. It's also a modern dramatization. It is not in Plutarch. The primary text says only that frightened people sold to him cheaply. It never describes him bargaining over the blaze, never describes him letting a house burn to force a sale. The cruelty we imagine is ours, painted on later. What Plutarch actually describes is in some ways more unsettling. Not a man shouting threats in the firelight, a man quietly, reliably present at the worst moment of your life, with cash in hand. His crews put out the fires. His crews rebuilt the ruins, and then he rented them out to the very people who'd once owned them, or to whoever came next. The largest part of Rome, Plutarch tells us, came into his possession. Now, that's a rhetorical flourish, not a survey. We can't put a number on it, and we shouldn't try, but the direction is clear enough. Block by block, fire by fire, the city was quietly becoming his. And then a second door opened, wider, darker, and entirely legal. His name was Sulla, the dictator. When Sulla seized Rome, he published proscription lists, names of his enemies, declared outlaws, their property seized by the state and auctioned off, cheap, very often to Sulla's own supporters. And buying it wasn't just permitted, it was politically encouraged. Plutarch says Crassus was never tired of accepting or of buying the confiscated estates of the condemned. There is one old rumor, and Plutarch hedges it. He writes, "It is said that Crassus once slipped a man's name onto a list who didn't belong there, and that Sulla, suspecting it, never trusted him with such business again. One rumored instance carefully flagged even by the man who recorded it. Not a habit. But it tells you the appetite was there. A man who profited when the city burned, and profited again when the state turned on its own. By the time he was finished, a single man held the title to most of Rome, and he had a private definition of what that even made him. How rich did this make him? Let's try to hold the scale, even across 2,000 years. Plutarch tells us his estate grew from around 300 talents to 7,100. And Pliny the Elder, the great Roman cataloguer of facts, put the value of his land alone at 200 million sesterces, naming him the richest Roman after Sulla himself. And here's the detail that should make you sit up. Pliny says that figure was his real estate only. It pointedly did not count his silver mines. It did not count his slaves. 200 million sesterces, on the order, some historians reckon, of the entire annual revenue of the Roman treasury. In land he just happened to own. But the number that really tells you who Crassus was isn't a number at all. It's a sentence. Both Plutarch and Pliny record the same maxim from him, his personal, private definition of wealth. A man, Crassus said, is not truly rich unless he can pay for an army out of his own income, not a household, not an estate, an army. That was his yardstick. And the unsettling thing is, he could. So what does a man like that do with it? He buys power. He bankrolls a rising young politician named Julius Caesar, covering his enormous debts when no one else would. He crushes the slave revolt of Spartacus, and here the dark side of that wealth shows plainly. The aftermath was 6,000 of the defeated crucified along the road into Rome, and we will not linger on it. Only note that it happened, and that Crassus paid for it. And in the year 60 BC, he joins with Caesar and with Pompey the Great to form the first triumvirate. 3 men quietly dividing the Roman world between them. Money, in his hands, had become political power itself. And yet, here's the thing about a man who measures himself by armies. There was one thing all that money could not buy, and it was the only thing he truly wanted. Glory. Military glory. The kind Pompey had. The kind Caesar was winning. Crassus had everything except the one prize that mattered to him. So an old man now, he went to take it. He marched east into Parthia, chasing a war that would make his name immortal. It destroyed him. At Carrhae, in 53 BC, his army was annihilated by a Parthian general named Surena, and Crassus himself was killed during a botched parley in the dust. Now, history would later mock him with a story almost certainly invented, that the Parthians poured molten gold down his dead throat, sneering, "You thirsted for gold, now drink it." It's a perfect ending for the greedy man, which is precisely why we should distrust it. Our best source, Plutarch, says simply that he was beheaded. The gold is legend, a punishment the storytellers wished on him, not one history records. And the loophole, the great gap he had spent his life pouring fortune through, it was finally closed, not by a law aimed at him, but by time. When Augustus at last gave Rome a public fire brigade, the vigiles, the vacuum Crassus had owned, simply ceased to exist. The institution Rome had been missing arrived. A monument, you might say, built long after the money was made. Crassus owned the disaster itself, and in the end, it was a different kind of fire that took him, the one in his own chest, the hunger money couldn't feed. Now I want to take you forward, nearly 2,000 years, and across an ocean, to a woman who proved the opposite trick entirely. Crassus got rich by owning the catastrophe. She would get rich by owning nothing at all. Nothing, at least, that the law could ever find. And it began with a question as simple as it is strange. Where exactly does a person legally live? Chapter 2. A Resident of Nowhere, Hetty Green. In the Gilded Age, the very rich had a particular way of being rich. They built mansions on Fifth Avenue, marble cottages in Newport, estates that announced from a quarter-mile away exactly how much money lived inside. It was the whole point, to be seen, to be known, to be unmistakably wealthy. And every one of those grand homes did something its owner rarely thought about. It fixed them in place. A mansion is an address. An address is a residence, and a residence is the single thread that ties a fortune to the tax collector. Because property taxes, income taxes, inheritance taxes, all of them, then as now, followed one quiet legal fact: domicile, where you live. If the state could prove you lived there, the state could tax you there. Hetty Green understood that thread better than anyone alive. And so she decided, with the cold logic that defined her whole life, to simply never give the state anything to hold on to. She was, by any measure, an extraordinary woman. Born on the 21st of November, 1834, into a New England whaling dynasty, she inherited a merchant fortune and then did something almost unheard of for a woman of her era. She ran it herself. No husband managing it for her. No trustee. No committee of men deciding what she could and couldn't do with her own money. Her. From a desk she kept in the lobby of a bank. She wouldn't pay for an office. Dressed always in the same severe rusty black dress and veil. A sharp-tongued woman who counted every single penny while sitting on one of the largest fortunes in America. The newspapers gave her a name for it. They called her the Witch of Wall Street. It was a slander, mostly. The woman they painted as a grasping, half-mad miser was, in truth, one of the sharpest financial minds of her century, a value investor, decades before the phrase existed. But she let them talk. Being underestimated, she understood, was its own kind of camouflage, and she had seen the thread. Wealth was chained to residency. So to beat the tax, to truly beat it, she would have to become something the law had no category for. A resident of nowhere at all. And she was perfectly willing to live like a pauper to do it. So, how does one of the richest women in America become a resident of nowhere? Slowly, deliberately, one cheap room at a time. Hetty Green did not have a home. She had a rotation, a drifting series of boarding houses and modest flats and residential hotels scattered across Brooklyn and, after 1898, across the river in Hoboken, New Jersey. Rooms that cost her somewhere between $23 and $60 a month. A woman worth $100 million or more, living in the kind of lodgings a clerk could afford, and moving on before any of them could quite become home. Why Hoboken after all those years in Brooklyn? Because in 1898, the 5 boroughs consolidated into a single Greater New York, and a bigger, hungrier city meant a longer tax reach. So, she stepped across the Hudson, new jurisdiction, clean slate, and then there's the detail that I confess I find quietly delightful. To keep any clerk in either state from ever pinning her down as a taxable resident, she registered for some of those rooms under assumed names. And the most famous of them was not even a person. It was her dog. A small Skye Terrier named Dewey, the richest woman in America, filing herself into a boarding house ledger behind the name of a little dog, so that when New York came looking for Mrs. Green and New Jersey came looking for Mrs. Green, what they found on the lease was, more or less, the terrier. There's a vast and humming machinery to a state's tax authority. Assessors, records, registries, the whole apparatus of a government that wants its due, and it was defeated, again and again, by a woman who simply would not stay still, and by a dog's name on a rent book. Think about the asymmetry of it, because that's where the whole trick lives. A state has almost unlimited power to tax, but only over people it can locate. Its entire claim rests on a single fact, that you live here. And that was the one fact Hetty Green would never hand over. She didn't fight the tax, didn't dispute the rate, didn't hire lawyers to argue the law in front of a judge. She did something far simpler and far harder to beat. She denied the state the one thing it needed before the question of tax could even begin. By some estimates, had she ever admitted to being a permanent New York resident, she'd have owed something on the order of $30,000 a year. She paid it instead in cheap rent and inconvenience. It was, in its way, the best deal in America. Now, I'd be lying to you if I said this was all cold strategy. It wasn't, entirely. The truth is that Hetty Green was also genuinely miserly, frugal to a degree that crossed over into something stranger, something that ran deeper than tax planning. Both things were true at once. The discipline was a weapon, and it was also, perhaps, a kind of compulsion she couldn't have switched off if she'd wanted to. But here is what mattered, legally. She kept no fixed home, and so neither New York nor New Jersey could ever establish, to the standard the law required, that she was domiciled there. You cannot tax a resident you cannot find, and she made absolutely certain she could not be found. The world called her a miser. The world called her a witch. And then the entire financial system nearly fell apart, and the pauper in the rusty black dress turned out to be holding the one thing everyone in America suddenly, desperately wanted. Because here is the part the caricature never had room for. The frugality wasn't pathology, it was preparation. Hetty Green's investing creed was simple, and she said it plainly. I buy when things are low, and nobody wants them. She hoarded cash, vast reserves of it, precisely so that when everyone else was panicking, forced to sell at any price, she would be the one person in the room with money to lend. She wasn't hiding from the markets. She was waiting for them to break. And in the autumn of 1907, they broke. The panic of 1907 seized up the entire American financial system. Banks failed, credit vanished, and even the city of New York found itself unable to borrow the money it needed to function. The great J.P. Morgan convened an emergency meeting of the most powerful financiers in the country to stop the bleeding. And there, at that table, the only woman in the room, sat Hetty Green. The woman they'd been mocking for 30 years as a half-cracked miser wrote out a check to the city of New York for roughly $1.1 million, taking short-term revenue bonds in return. The beggar in black was, it turned out, a lender of last resort to the largest city in the nation. Everything the press had laughed at, the cheap rooms, the worn dress, the hoarded cash, it had all been pointing at this. She had looked like poverty. She had been power, kept in reserve, waiting. That was the thing the nickname never captured. The witch wasn't superstition, it was foresight, dressed in black and mistaken for madness because it refused to spend. She died on the 3rd of July, 1916, at 81 years old, in her son's home in New York City, the richest woman in America. Her fortune is hard to pin to a single figure, and I won't pretend otherwise. The estimates run from around $100 million to as much as $200 million. An astonishing sum then, several billion in today's money. It would pass, in the end, to her 2 children, her son Ned and her daughter Sylvia, split between them. And now the seam pays off from beyond the grave. Because the moment she died, 2 state treasuries leaned in. New York and New Jersey had both spent years trying to tax this woman, and her estate was the last, richest chance to do it. They made, by every contemporary account, prolonged and expensive efforts. And they both lost. Because Hetty Green's will was probated, quietly and uncontested, in a tiny town that neither state had ever thought to watch. Bellows Falls, Vermont. The low-tax domicile she had nominally claimed for decades, while she drifted between cheap rooms under a dog's name. The whole long performance, every $23 room, every assumed name, every move across the river, resolved, finally, in a small Vermont probate court. She had beaten the taxman in life, and then, one last time, she beat him from the grave. It's worth saying that the door she walked through has largely been shut since. Modern rules on residency and domicile, on estate taxation, have made this kind of open jurisdiction shopping far harder than it was in her day. But in her day, the gap was real. The law assumed the rich lived somewhere, and she lived her whole long life inside it. Before we go on, let me say one quiet thing, and then I'll get straight back to it. If you're listening to this with your eyes closed, drifting, you should know there's a video version of these episodes too. Our animators and our editors put real, careful work into the visuals. The firelight over Crassus's Rome, the cold glamour of a gilded age that looked away from a woman in black. And for an episode like this one, it's genuinely worth seeing whenever you're awake enough to want to. Hetty Green defended her fortune by making certain no one could ever find her. The next man built his by making certain his rivals paid for the privilege of competing with him at all, by getting the railroads to hand him a cut of every barrel his enemies dared to ship. We are about to meet the bookkeeper from the barrel. Chapter 3. The Bookkeeper and the Barrel. John D. Rockefeller. So, let's go back to that barrel. The independent refiner who shipped it, the one who paid 80 cents and never knew that 40 of them would be quietly mailed to the rival trying to ruin him. He was real, and he was one of dozens like him, scratching a living out of the oil fields and the refineries of Cleveland. And the quiet, penny-counting bookkeeper across town, the one who'd seen the gap when no one else did. His name was John Davison Rockefeller, a devout Baptist, abstemious, tight-lipped, a man who kept his own books to the last cent and never once raised his voice. Someone who knew him well called him the most ruthless, gentle man in America. Both halves of that are true, and you should hold them both, because the story doesn't make sense without them. Now, to understand what he saw, you have to understand the world he was standing in. The American oil business in the 1870s was chaos, pure chaos. The crude came out of the ground in western Pennsylvania faster than anyone could use it. Prices swung wildly, and refineries had sprung up everywhere, far too many of them, all undercutting each other, most of them barely surviving. It was a gold rush in its ugliest phase. Everyone digging, almost no one getting rich, the whole industry drowning in its own product. And running through the middle of it all were the railroads. They carried the crude from the oil regions to the refineries, and the refined kerosene out to the world. They published official freight rates, printed tariffs, the same price, in theory, for everyone. A published price. The same rate, surely, that everyone pays. But here's the gap Rockefeller saw, the seam between what the rule said and what the rule meant. Those published rates weren't actually binding. The railroads were locked in their own brutal competition, and what they craved more than anything was steady, reliable, high-volume traffic. A shipper big enough to fill their trains every single day. And to a shipper like that, they would quietly do almost anything. They would cut a secret deal. They would hand back part of the freight he'd paid, a rebate on his own oil, and nothing. Yet, said they couldn't. In 1871, that idea took its boldest, most naked form. A scheme called the South Improvement Company. Rockefeller joined it. So did Tom Scott, the swaggering president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. And the design of it is the thing that makes a modern listener sit up in the dark. The railroads would raise their published rates for everyone. Then they'd secretly rebate the members of the scheme, the big refiners, on their own freight. And, this is the part, they'd hand those same members a drawback. A cut of the freight paid by everyone who wasn't in the scheme. By the independents. By the rivals. Sit with the arithmetic of that, because the journalist Ida Tarbell, who would one day take this whole machine apart, laid it out exactly. An independent refiner pays 80 cents to ship a barrel of crude, and the railroad, she wrote, sends 40 cents of that money to the combination, while the combination's own refiner pays only 40 cents to ship the same barrel. Do the math, and it's a 2-to-1 cost advantage, built not on working harder, not on a better refinery, but on the simple, breathtaking fact that your competitor now pays a toll on every barrel he ships directly to you. That is the receipt in someone else's name. That is the barrel from the cold open. And here is the strange twist that almost no one remembers. It never happened. The South Improvement Company never shipped a single barrel of oil. The moment word of the scheme leaked, the oil regions erupted. Independent producers and refiners rose up in fury. They blockaded the combination, refused to sell it crude, marched and petitioned, and roared. And within months, the Pennsylvania legislature repealed the company's charter. April of 1872, before it had moved one drop. The most notorious loophole in the history of American business, the one where your enemy funds the man crushing him, was dead on the page, killed by public revolt before it ever earned a cent. So if you've heard that the South Improvement Company made Rockefeller's fortune, set that down. It didn't. It couldn't have. It never operated. What it did was something quieter. And in the end, far more important. It exposed the playbook. It showed Rockefeller, and it showed the railroads, exactly what the gap was worth. And the playbook itself didn't die in 1872. It just went underground, because here's what actually built the fortune. Even as the public scheme collapsed, Rockefeller and his partner Henry Flagler, the man who did the real negotiating with the railroads, kept cutting individual, secret rebate deals, one railroad at a time, quietly, for years. An investigation in 1879 would find that Standard Oil was receiving substantial freight rebates on essentially all of the oil it shipped by rail. Not a scheme that made headlines. 1,000 small private arrangements that never did. The roar of the South Improvement Company was the distraction. The silence afterward was the engine. And in those same weeks of early 1872, even as the scandal raged, Rockefeller turned the cost advantage and the sheer threat of it on the refiners of his own city, Cleveland. He went to his competitors one after another, and he made them an offer. Sell to me now, take standard stock, or take cash, and you'll come out whole. Or stay and try to compete against a man who ships at half your cost. It wasn't a war that took years. It took weeks. In the span of about 2 months, Rockefeller absorbed 22 of his 26 Cleveland rivals. History would come to call it the Cleveland Massacre, though not a shot was fired and not a law was broken. The men who sold simply did the math, the same math Tarbell would later publish, and concluded there was no other ending. And once you understand that pattern, the rest of it is just scale. Standard Oil of Ohio, founded in January of 1870, kept doing across the country what it had done in Cleveland. The cost advantage, the quiet rebate, the offer the rival couldn't refuse. By the late 1870s, this one company refined more than 90% of all the oil in the United States. 90%. From a chaos of hundreds of little refineries in less than a decade, one man's organization now held nearly the entire industry in its hands. But 90% of an industry creates a problem that the law thought it had already solved. And solving that problem would require a word, a small, dusty, harmless-sounding word that would come to define the next 100 years of American capitalism. Here was the problem. American corporate law in those days was state law, and the states were jealous. A company chartered in Ohio generally could not legally own a company in Pennsylvania or New York or anywhere else. So Rockefeller had built something the law had no box for. He controlled refineries and pipelines and barrel works and shipping operations scattered across a dozen states. But on paper, there was no lawful way for his Ohio company to own them all. The empire existed, in fact. It could not exist on paper, and anything that can't exist on paper can, eventually, be pulled apart. This is where the second loophole finder enters. Not a railroad man, not a refiner, but a lawyer. A mild, brilliant, almost invisible man named Samuel Dodd, Standard's in-house counsel. And Dodd did something that, in its quiet way, is as audacious as anything in this whole long night of stories. He reached back into a sleepy corner of property law, the ancient legal device by which one person holds assets in trust for another, and he repurposed it. On the 2nd of January, 1882, the stock of some 40 different standard-aligned companies was placed into the hands of 9 trustees. The shareholders got trust certificates in return. The companies stayed legally separate. No Ohio firm owned the New York one, but 9 men now controlled every one of them, in concert, from a single office. They called it the Standard Oil Trust, and from that one act of legal imagination comes the entire vocabulary of American monopoly. Trust, antitrust, all of it. The word we still use to mean a giant, predatory combination started its life as a humble instrument for managing a widow's estate. There's a detail about Dodd I find quietly telling. He reportedly refused, on principle, to own any Standard Oil stock at all, so that his legal advice could never be colored by his own enrichment. The man who built the most powerful corporate structure in the world made sure he had no personal stake in the verdict. Whatever else you make of these people, they were not careless. They were precise. And the trust did exactly what it was built to do. It made the grip invisible. For years, the public couldn't even prove that Standard owned the companies it secretly ran. You can't break what you can't see. But the nation saw enough. The reckoning came, the way it always comes in these stories, afterward. The Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, the Ohio Supreme Court voiding the trust agreement in 92, at which point Standard simply reorganized itself as a New Jersey holding company and carried on. And finally, on the 15th of May, 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States ordered Standard Oil broken into 34 separate companies. The pieces are still with us. Exxon, Chevron, and the rest carry that broken empire's blood. It took the highest court in the land to undo what one accountant and one lawyer had quietly assembled. And the scale of what they'd built? Rockefeller's personal fortune peaked around 1913 at something near $900 million. To make that mean something, hold it against the whole country. It was on the order of 2.3% of the entire economic output of the United States. In 1916, he became the first billionaire in American history. Adjusted for the size of the economy he lived in, he is very likely the richest single human being who has ever lived. Not because he drilled the most wells or refined the cleanest oil, but because he understood, earlier and more coldly than anyone, that a fortune lives in the seam between what a rule says and what a rule does. Now, hold that image. One quiet man, one invisible structure, an entire industry gathered into a single fist. Because I want to take you almost a full century back from that Supreme Court ruling and clear across the world to a port city on the far side of the planet. There was another quiet man there, frail, soft-spoken, sickly, who never built a trust and never needed to. He didn't have to gather the door to an entire empire's trade into his hands. The emperor had already done that for him. The only door into China, the key. Howqua. Imagine an empire that decides to let the entire Western world in through a single keyhole. That was Qing China from the year 1757 by decree of the Qianlong Emperor. All Western maritime trade, every ship, every chest of tea, every bale of silk bound for Europe or America was funneled through one port, and one port only. Canton, what we'd now call Guangzhou. The whole hungry, expanding commercial appetite of the West, squeezed through a single gate on the south coast of China. Historians call it the Canton system, and it lasted almost unchanged for the better part of a century. And inside that gate, the rules tightened further. Foreign traders could not enter China proper. They could not, officially, even learn the Chinese language. They could not deal directly with the farmers who grew the tea or the officials who governed the province. They were confined to a cramped strip of waterfront, the so-called 13 factories, and there, every single transaction they wished to make had to pass through a licensed Chinese middleman, not any merchant, a member of a small, state-sanctioned guild, the Kohong. Roughly 13 licensed Hong merchants, and them alone, were legally permitted to trade with the foreigners and to stand surety for them. Do you see the gap yet? It's the same shape as so many of the others, and yet it sits at the opposite pole from Rockefeller. He had to fight and buy and scheme his way to 90% of an industry. Here, the monopoly was simply handed out by imperial law. If you held one of those rare licenses, you didn't need a trust or a rebate or a cost advantage. The license itself was the moat. No license, no legal trade, and only a handful of licenses in all the world. The man who held the best of them was named Wu Bingjian, though every Western trader on that waterfront knew him by his trade name, Howqua. And he was, in almost every respect, the opposite of what you'd picture at the center of the richest commercial fortune on earth. Not loud, not grasping. He was frail, physically delicate, soft-spoken almost to the point of disappearing. A man so quiet and so abstemious he seemed nearly ascetic. He'd inherited the family firm, the Yihai Hong, from his father at the dawn of the century, and he ran it with two qualities the foreigners came to prize above all others: an almost supernatural head for credit and numbers, and a reputation for honesty so total that his personal mark, his chop on a cargo, was worth more than any contract. By his own reckoning, this quiet, sickly man at the gate would soon be worth more than the most famous banker in all of Europe. And the foreigners crowding his waterfront had no idea that they were about to start borrowing from him. Here is how a man becomes rich, sitting still at a gate everyone must pass through. Howqua's firm took the largest share of the trade flowing through Canton. To put one figure on it, in the year 1830 alone, he sold the British East India Company somewhere around 50,800 chests of tea, roughly 18% of all the China tea that vast company bought that year, from one merchant. But the tea was only the beginning. The Western firms that came to Canton were chronically short of cash. Their silver was always somewhere else, on a ship, 6 months away. And so Howqua did for them what a bank does. He extended credit. He lent. He let them trade on his money. Slowly, quietly, the man at the gate became not just the seller they bought from, but the banker they owed. And then he did something almost no one in his position had thought to do. He sent his fortune abroad. He trusted certain young Americans, men like the Boston trader John Murray Forbes, whom he treated almost as a son, to carry his capital across the ocean and invest it in the New World. Howqua's money would end up in American railroads, in the Michigan Central, financing the iron arteries of a country he would never see. Sit with that inversion for a moment, because it upends everything we assume about that century. The richest private man in the world was not a London banker or a New York industrialist. By contemporary estimates, he was a Chinese tea merchant, and American tycoons in the making were borrowing from him. How rich, exactly? Here I have to be careful and honest with you, the way these stories deserve. The famous claim, richest man in the world, rests largely on Howqua's own estimate of his wealth, made in 1834. Around 26 million silver dollars. There was no audited ledger, no independent accounting. It's a contemporary estimate, a reasonable comparison of his age, not a proven fact. But the comparison is staggering all the same. Nathan Rothschild, the most celebrated financier in Europe, a name that still means money 2 centuries later, was reckoned to be worth around $5 million a few years earlier. By his own count, Howqua was several times the size of the most famous banker on earth. In today's money, the figure runs to several billion, by estimates that vary widely. And I won't pretend to a precision the sources don't have. But the number isn't what people remembered about Howqua. What they remembered was a single afternoon. And because it's the kind of story that grows in the telling, let me give it to you the way it actually came down to us, as the American trader William Hunter told it, years later, in his memoir of those Canton days. There was a Boston merchant who'd fallen on hard luck and couldn't sail home because he owed Howqua a debt, $72,000. a fortune. The man was trapped by it, and Howqua, hearing of it, sent for the man's promissory note. He looked at it. He told the merchant, in the trader's pidgin of the day, that the two of them were old friends, that the man was honest and had simply had no luck, and then he tore the note in half. The debt was finished. The man was free to go home. A fortune-sized debt, torn up without a flicker, by a man large enough not to feel the loss. That was the figure at the gate. And the gate, in the end, did not survive the century that made him. Because the trade that flowed through Canton had a dark current running beneath the tea. Opium, carried into China by Western firms in defiance of imperial law, was poisoning the country and draining its silver. When the Qing moved to stop it, Britain answered with gunboats. The First Opium War. And when it ended, the Treaty of Nanking in 1842 swept the whole old system away. It abolished the Canton system, dissolved the Kohong, and threw open 5 ports where there had been 1. The single keyhole was smashed. The monopoly that had made Howqua the richest man on earth simply ceased to exist. And Howqua himself died the very next year in 1843. Outlived by the system that made him by a single year. His money ran on without him, in American rails on the far side of the world. His whole fortune had lived and died by being inside one empire's single permitted door, which makes the next man almost his exact mirror, because he would build a fortune by belonging to no nation's rules at all. Where Howqua thrived by standing inside the one gate everyone had to pass through, this man thrived by flying a flag that answered to no gate, no nation, and no law. A flag chosen for one reason, every ship that sails the open because ocean, it asked no carries questions. An invisible country with it. It's the flag. The flag a vessel flies determines whose law governs it, whose taxes it pays, what wages it must give its crew, what safety rules bind its captain. A ship is, in a sense, a floating piece of whatever nation's flag flutters off its stern. And for most of maritime history, that meant a real country with real demands. A ship flying the American flag had to be American-owned and American-crewed, taxed under American law, held to American standards. Same for Britain. Same for Greece. The flag was an anchor to a homeland, and the homeland always wanted its due. Now, into this world comes a refugee. Aristotle Onassis, born in Smyrna in 1906, a city he and his family fled in catastrophe, an outsider with charm, cigars, dark glasses, and an absolute refusal to accept the walls the establishment put in front of him. And after the Second World War, those walls were considerable. America had built a vast fleet of merchant ships for the war, and now it had a glut of them, surplus tankers and cargo ships. It was selling off cheap under a law called the Merchant Ship Sales Act of 1946, a bargain of the century. But there was a catch, and the catch was aimed squarely at men like Onassis. The ships could be sold only to American citizens. He was Greek. He was excluded. When he tried to buy in his own name, The United States Maritime Commission turned him away. So he found not one door around the wall, but two. The first was a flag. Onassis discovered what a small number of ship owners were just beginning to grasp, that certain nations would register a foreign-owned ship for a fee and ask almost nothing else. No serious tax. No strict wage law. No demanding safety code. Panama had been doing it since the 1920s. Liberia opened its registry in 1948. Register your Greek-owned tanker in Liberia, and in the eyes of the law, your ship was Liberian, which is to say, it answered to almost no one. Onassis flew his fleet under these flags, holding the ships through a web of shell companies in Panama, Liberia, Uruguay, and Honduras. His tankers paid no nation's income tax, obeyed no nation's wage laws, answered to no nation's safety inspectors because, in the only sense a court recognized, they were Liberian, or Panamanian, or Honduran. This was the loophole, and I want to be precise about it, because it's often told wrong. Onassis did not invent the flag of convenience. The practice was older than he was. What he did was popularize it, exploit it more boldly and at greater scale than anyone before him, and in doing so show the entire shipping world the way. The flag move was, start to finish, entirely legal. A fee, a registry, a flag, nothing more. But the second door, the one he used to get the ships in the first place, was not legal at all. And that was the door that would eventually put Aristotle Onassis under arrest. The ships were the problem. Locked out of the American surplus fleet, Onassis did something the flag trick had taught him. If the law tests paperwork rather than control, then give it the paperwork it wants. He formed American companies with names like United States Petroleum Carriers, and he installed American citizens as their directors. On paper, these were American firms, fully entitled to buy American ships. In fact, they were controlled by a Greek shipping magnate who wasn't entitled to anything of the sort. The front directors included men of real standing, among them a former Massachusetts congressman. The companies were American in costume only, and through them, Onassis acquired 23 surplus T, 2 tankers that the law had reserved for genuinely American hands. Note that, by the way, 23 T2 tankers, not Liberty ships, whatever you may have heard. The Liberty ship was the famous workhorse cargo vessel of the war. The controversy that snared Onassis was specifically about the fast T2 oil tankers. It's a small thing, but these stories live or die on getting the small things right. The flag move was a loophole. This was fraud. And the difference is the whole chapter, because both tricks exploited the very same blind spot, the one that runs like a fault line under so many of these fortunes. The law tests the paperwork, not the truth behind it. A Liberian flag on a Greek-owned ship. An American company that's really a Greek one. The same sleight of hand, pointed in 2 directions. On the 13th of October, 1953, a grand jury in Washington, sitting in secret, returned an indictment. Onassis, 8 other individuals, and 6 corporations, charged under the Federal False Statements Act, over those 23 tankers. In February of 1954, he flew into New York, and the richest shipowner on Earth, or near it, was arrested, cuffed, booked, and then almost nothing happened to him. He settled the government's civil claims for around $7 million, admitted no criminal guilt, and walked away with his empire fully intact. To a man whose tankers were already minting money on every ocean, $7 million was not a punishment. It was a toll. He paid it, and he sailed on. There's a dry little detail here that I can't leave out, because the universe seems to have arranged it deliberately. The official who handled that settlement for the government, the man on the other side of the table from Onassis, was a then Assistant Attorney General named Warren Burger. And Warren Burger would go on, some years later, to become the Chief Justice of the United States. The man who pursued Aristotle Onassis for sailing around the law ended up at the very summit of it. And the loophole, the flag part, the legal part, the part he merely popularized, it was never closed. It conquered. Today, the majority of all the world's shipping tonnage flies exactly these flags of convenience: Panama, Liberia, and the rest. His fleet topped 70 vessels in his lifetime, held through that scattered web of shell companies and stateless flags. The fraud cost him $7 million and an afternoon in handcuffs. The loophole became the way the entire world ships oil. He had been arrested for it, and he had won. Let me step out of the dark for just a moment. We're pushing towards something small, 500 of you, following the show. It isn't much, I know. But it's progress, and the truth is we need your help to get there. If one of these episodes has stayed with you, share your favorite with a friend. Rate the show if you would. And leave a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from, or the one story from history that stayed with you longest. That small bit of activity is what tells the algorithm to carry this show to more people like you. Now, settle back in, because the next door we open belongs to a company that didn't escape a nation's law. It became one. A firm that sold cloth and woke up one morning as the tax collector of 30 million people. Here is a question worth sitting with in the dark. What does it actually take to turn a company into a country? Not a metaphor, the literal thing. A private business, chartered to buy and sell goods, that wakes up one morning holding the lawful right to tax a province of millions. It happened. Once. And the unsettling part is how few laws had to be broken to do it. The company was the British East India Company. On paper, in the middle of the 1700s, it was exactly what its name said, a chartered trading firm. It bought cloth. It bought saltpetre for gunpowder and tea for London's drawing rooms and sold them home at a markup. Real political power in Bengal, the rich, fertile heart of eastern India, belonged to its ruler, the Nawab, who governed in turn under the distant, fading sovereignty of the Mughal emperor in Delhi. And the right to tax a province was the emperor's prerogative, run through his own revenue office. A merchant did not tax anybody. A merchant asked permission to trade and paid for the privilege. But the company had something most merchants didn't: it had an army. And in 1757, it had a soldier named Robert Clive, ambitious, cold, and entirely without scruple, who looked at the politics of Bengal the way Rockefeller looked at a freight tariff. He saw the gap. The young Nawab, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, had quarreled with the company. So Clive did something far more elegant than fight him. He conspired with the Nawab's own commander, a man named Mir Jafar, and bought him stand aside on the battlefield, and the throne is yours afterward. They met at a place called Plassey on the 23rd of June, 1757, and what the history books call the Battle of Plassey was, in almost every sense that matters, not a battle at all. Clive's force was small, on the order of 3,000 men. The Nawab's army was something close to 50,000. By every ordinary measure of war, Clive should have been annihilated. But the arithmetic had already been settled in private. A huge portion of that army belonged to Mir Jafar, the bribed commander, and it simply stood there, did nothing. A monsoon soaked the Nawab's gunpowder, while the British had thought to cover theirs. By the end of the day, the larger army had broken, and the cost to Clive's side was almost nothing, somewhere between 20 and 50 men dead, against a force of 50,000. And there's a darker thread that tells you exactly what kind of victory this was. When a local merchant named Umikand threatened to expose the conspiracy unless he got an enormous cut, Clive had 2 treaties drawn up, a real one and a fake one promising Umikand his money. A British admiral refused to sign the fake, so his signature was simply forged onto it. India's later Prime Minister, Nehru, would say Clive won Bengal by promoting treason and forgery. And then Clive walked through the treasury at Murshidabad and pocketed something on the order of £160,000 in a single day. A useful word came into English around this era, carried home from exactly this kind of plunder. The word was loot. But winning a battle only made Clive a kingmaker. The real prize was something else, a single piece of paper that would turn a company that sold cloth into the tax collector of an entire province. And the strangest thing about that paper is that it was completely legal. The Mughal system, for all its grandeur, contained a quiet little administrative device, and Clive found it the way every figure in this long night found their seam. It was called the Diwani. And the Diwani was simply an office, the legal right to collect a province's land revenue and run its fiscal affairs. The crucial detail, the detail that makes the whole story turn, is that it was an office that could be granted, transferred, handed from the emperor to whomever the emperor chose. A position like an appointment, and appointments can be given away. Now, 7 years after Plassey, the company's army won another fight, a real one, this time at Buxar in 1764, against the combined forces of a deposed Nawab, a neighboring ruler, and the Mughal emperor himself, Shah Alam II. And when you have just defeated the emperor on the field, the emperor is not in a strong position to refuse you very much. So on the 12th of August, 1765, Shah Alam II granted the Diwani of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, 3 provinces not to a person, not to Clive, to the company, to the corporation itself. A private, profit-seeking trading business now held a legitimate imperial office, sealed by a formal decree of the Mughal crown, giving it the lawful right to assess and collect the taxes of somewhere between 20 and 30 million human beings. Let that settle. 20 to 30 million people taxed by a company. And it was legal, genuinely, unarguably legal, because it came wrapped in a real Mughal decree, in the proper form, from the rightful sovereign. This wasn't a safe being cracked. It was the same trick we keep meeting in the dark. The law tests the paperwork, not the truth underneath it. The paperwork said, Revenue Office. The truth said, a merchant had just become a government. What the company built on top of it was almost surgical. They left the Nawab on his throne, the policing, the criminal courts, the ceremony, all the visible furniture of rule, and simply took the money and the power behind it. Historians call it the dual government. The company held the purse, the Nawab held the costume. The historian William Dalrymple calls the whole maneuver an act of involuntary privatization, the tax collection of an empire's richest province, subcontracted to a corporation, protected by that corporation's own private army. And the cleanest verdict anyone has rendered on it is 3 words: power without responsibility. The scale of what flowed from that one document is hard to hold in the mind. The company now had the right to collect something like £3 million a year in gross land revenue, and I say gross, because the real surplus, after collection, and the army, and a tribute paid back to the emperor, was smaller. That tribute ran to about £260,000 a year, the Emperor of India drawing a pension from the company that had taken his taxes. And Clive himself, when he finally left India in 1767, it was worth somewhere around £401,000, the largest self-made fortune in Europe at the time. A soldier of no particular birth, richer by his own hand than almost any inherited magnate on the continent. A company now owned the right to tax a province, and within 4 years, that province would starve, and the company would raise the taxes anyway. I want to be careful here, and quiet, because what happened next is one of the great catastrophes of the 18th century, and it does not need me to dramatize it. The facts are enough. In 1769, the rains failed in Bengal, and a drought took hold. By 1770, it had become a famine, and not an ordinary one. By the most sober reckoning, 1/4 to 1/3 of the entire population of Bengal died. Contemporary estimates ran as high as 10 million, though I'll be honest with you, as these stories deserve, the precise number is genuinely disputed, and modern scholars argue it both ways. So I'll hold to the figure the sources agree on, and that is terrible enough on its own. 1/4 to 1/3 of a province. Gone. And here is the part I want you to sit with, not the suffering, which I'll leave where it belongs, but the conduct. The company, holding the Diwani, holding the lawful right to tax these people, did not lower the taxes as the province starved. It raised them, roughly 10%, in the famine year. Its own agents ran private monopolies in grain. And the first Governor-General of Bengal, Warren Hastings, would later admit, in the cold language of administration, that the revenue had been violently kept up to its former standard, which means, in plain English, that the company collected more tax in the year of the famine than it had before it. They balanced their books on a catastrophe. The drought was an act of nature. What the company did with it was a choice. And now the irony that closes the whole arc, and it is a bleak one. This corporation held the single richest revenue stream in Asia. It had just extracted more from a starving province than from a healthy one. And within a few years of all that, it went broke. Mismanagement, corruption, the costs of its own armies, debt on debt. By 1772, the East India Company, owner of Bengal's taxes, was effectively bankrupt. So the most powerful corporation on earth did the thing powerful corporations have done in every century since. It went to the government and asked to be rescued. In 1773, the British state advanced it around £1.4 million. Too big to fail 250 years before the phrase existed. But that bailout was the lever. Once the government's money was in the company, the government's hand was on it. The Regulating Act of 1773 brought the first real state oversight. Pitt's India Act in 1784 tightened the grip further. And the long unwinding ran for the better part of a century, until, after a great rebellion in 1857, the Government of India Act of 1858 abolished company rule entirely and handed India to the Crown. That was the moment the loophole finally closed. Not by a courtroom, by the state simply rewriting the rule a monument raised long after the fortune was made and the bill had come due. As for Clive, when Parliament hauled him in 1773, and questioned him over the wealth he'd carried out of Bengal, he is on record with a single, famous line. Accused in effect of rapacity, he said, "By God, Mr. Chairman, at this moment I stand astonished at my own moderation." And then Parliament, having heard him, resolved that he had rendered great and meritorious services to his country, officially thanked. And the next year, in 1774, Robert Clive died by his own hand. It's generally accepted, though no inquest was ever held. A company took a throne's tax office by force and by forgery, let a province starve under it, and was pried loose only by the state that made it. The next man we meet did something quieter and older, and in its way more cunning. He didn't seize a sovereign's revenue at gunpoint. He lent to sovereigns and took his repayment in the only currency a sovereign truly controls. He was repaid in crowns. Picture, for a moment, a continent full of the powerful and the broke. That's Europe at the dawn of the 1500s, and it's the world Jakob Fugger was born into in the German city of Augsburg in 1459. The kings and dukes and great princes of the church held titles, lands, mines, crowns, rich in everything except the one thing that actually moves: cash, liquid money, coin you can put in a hand today. And the high offices of the church themselves were, in plain truth, for sale. You bought a bishopric from Rome. If you wanted to hold more than one at a time, you paid the Pope for a special dispensation. And the Pope of the moment, Leo X, a Medici, of all families, needed money badly because he was building the new St. Peter's Basilica, and cathedrals are not cheap. Do you see the gap? It's the oldest one in this whole night of stories, and the simplest. Everyone needed cash now. And the man who could put cash on the table now could name his terms and take his repayment in whatever the borrower happened to control. Jakob Fugger was that man, cold, meticulous, devout, entirely without sentiment about where a profit came from. He sat in the middle of every cash flow in Europe and took a cut of each one. The first cut still takes the breath away. An ambitious young nobleman named Albert of Brandenburg wanted the great archbishopric of Mainz, wanted it badly enough to borrow a fortune from the Fuggers to pay Rome for it, dispensation and all. But how does a churchman repay a banker's fortune? Here is where it becomes something out of a dark fable. In 1515, Pope Leo issued a formal decree authorizing the sale of indulgences in Albert's territory, indulgences being, in the understanding of the day, a way for ordinary believers to buy a reduction of their time in purgatory for themselves or for the souls of the dead. And the proceeds were quietly split, roughly half to Rome, to the building of St. Peter's, and roughly half to repay the loan from Jakob Fugger. Sit with that. A frightened peasant lays a coin down to shorten a dead mother's suffering in the afterlife, and a portion of that coin travels, by prior arrangement, into the ledger of a bank in Augsburg. By the accounts that come down to us, a Fugger agent actually traveled with the most famous of the indulgence sellers, a friar named Tetzel, keeping watch over the chest and the count, with Fugger taking a small percentage on every shipment. I'll say plainly that the most vivid versions of that image, the agent at the friar's elbow, a hand on the lock, reach us through later retellings, so hold the details lightly. But the structure is well documented, and the structure is the thing. Salvation, itemized. And none of it was a crime. I want to be exact about that, the way these stories require. Selling offices, dispensations, indulgences, this was the ordinary, accepted machinery of the church of its time. A theological scandal, not a legal one. The law of the age permitted every step, which is precisely why it worked. Financing forgiveness was lucrative, but it was about to become world historical because the friar's hard sell would summon a furious monk named Martin Luther. And Fugger, even then, was already looking past cathedrals and indulgences towards something far larger. A crown. The monk arrived in 1517. Appalled by the spectacle of salvation sold for coin in the streets, a theology professor named Martin Luther nailed his 95 theses to a church door in Wittenberg and attack, point by point, on the very indulgences Fugger had helped finance. And from that spark caught the Reformation, the great fracture that split Western Christianity in two. There's an uncomfortable truth buried in that famous moment. The protest that broke the church was, in part, a protest against a banking arrangement. The man who lit the fuse, you could fairly say, was not only the monk with the hammer. It was also the accountant in Augsburg who had turned forgiveness into a revenue stream. But here is the measure of Jakob Fugger's nerve. While the religious world was catching fire over what he'd done, he was already arranging something even more audacious. He was going to buy an emperor. In 1519, the throne of the Holy Roman Empire fell vacant, and the way that throne was filled was almost designed for a man like Fugger. The emperor was chosen by 7 electors, 7 princes, and their votes were, quite openly, for sale. This wasn't corruption hiding in a corner. It was the accepted mechanics of the election. Whoever could pay the electors the most got to rule much of Europe. And the contest came down to 2 great houses, the young Habsburg heir, Charles, against the King of France, Francis I. The bribes that decided it ran to something on the order of 835 to 850,000 gulden in total, and I give that as a range. Oh, because these figures are reconstructed from old Habsburg accounts and vary by tens of thousands, depending on the source. Of that enormous sum, Jakob Fugger supplied the lion's share somewhere around 540 to 550,000 gulden. More than half. One banker fronting more than half the price of the most powerful crown in Christendom. Charles I. He became Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, and in the same stroke, deeply and personally indebted to the man who had bought him his throne. Fugger understood exactly what he held. Years later, when the emperor was slow to settle, Fugger wrote him a letter whose substance survives in every telling, that Charles could not have gained the Roman crown without Fugger's help, and that he, Fugger, could prove it. The exact wording shifts from translation to translation. The meaning never does. It is perhaps the most quietly terrifying sentence a creditor has ever written to a king. Holding an emperor's debt has its uses, and Fugger was about to need every bit of that leverage because the empire itself was preparing to make his entire fortune illegal. Beneath the indulgences and the crowns ran something more elemental and more durable: metal. This was the foundation under everything. Long before he was buying emperors, Fugger had been lending to cash-poor princes and taking their mineral wealth as collateral. After he financed a war for the Archduke Sigismund of Tyrol, he took the income of the Archduke's silver mines as repayment, and then the great silver of Schwarz on top of it. In Hungary, through a partnership with a mining engineer named Thurzo, he locked up the copper of a region whose output, at its height, is estimated near 40% of all the copper in Europe, though, as with all these old figures, take the precise share as an estimate, not gospel. Silver and copper, the literal raw material of money and war, much of it running through one man's hands. A near monopoly on the metal of a continent does not go unnoticed forever. In 1523, the empire moved against him. An imperial official lodged a formal complaint, and the Diet of Nuremberg, a great assembly of the realm, took up the question of whether to outlaw these vast commercial monopolies altogether. The law was, quite literally, coming for the source of Fugger's fortune. And it failed. It failed for the simplest reason in this entire chapter. The man with the power to crush the monopoly was Charles V, the Emperor Fugger had bought, the emperor who owed him. Charles quashed the effort. The bill was dropped. The monopoly survived because the one person who could have ended it was the one person most in Fugger's debt. The loophole was never closed. It was simply protected by the crown it had paid for. Jakob Fugger died on the 30th of December, 1525. He had no children. His empire passed to a nephew, Anton, who carried it on. And the scale of what he left behind. You will hear him called the richest person who ever lived, and you should know that that phrase is an estimate, not a measurement. It comes from a modern historian who reckoned his wealth at something near 2% of all of Europe's economic output. A striking claim, but it rests on stretching numbers across 5 centuries, and I won't hand it to you as fact. Let the firm figure carry the weight instead, and it's firm enough. At his death, after his debts, Jakob Fugger was worth somewhere around 2 million to 2.1 million gulden. A staggering, almost unreal sum for a single man in his age. But the number isn't quite what lingers. What lingers is the contradiction. Because the same icy banker who took a percentage of people's hope of heaven, who bought an emperor and held him hostage with a ledger, did something else with his money too. In 1521, he founded a settlement of small houses in Augsburg for the city's poor, the Fuggerei. And it is still there, still occupied, still run. And the rent it charges its residents, 500 years on, is 1 Rhenish guilder a year. In today's money, about 88 euro cents. 88 cents a year, and 3 prayers a day, said for the soul of the man who built it. Ruthlessness and piety written into the same ledger, in the same hand. Fugger's whole edge was that he alone could front the cash and name the terms. 5 centuries later, a very different kind of man would build a very different kind of edge, not money, but mathematics. A former codebreaker with the most successful trading machine ever assembled, and a single sheet of paper from a bank that turned tens of millions of trades into something the law was willing to tax, as if it was something else entirely. The wrapper, you'll notice, never really goes away. It just changes hands. Before we go on, one small thing, and it costs nothing. If a story tonight has caught at you, drop a comment and name it. An institution, an empire, a moment in history you'd love to hear pulled apart in the dark like this, or simply one of your own favorites. I read them. They're how I learn what to bring you next. Now, the next door we open belongs to a man who never built a trust and never bought a crown. He simply made 30 million trades a year open belongs to a man who never built a trust, patient, and never bought a long-term investment. He simply made 30 million trades a year and called the whole of it a single, patient, long-term investment. To understand how that is even possible, you have to meet the mind behind it, because he was not a Wall Street man at all. Jim Simons was a mathematician. A serious one, a prize-winning geometer, a former chairman of a university math department. And before any of that, during the Cold War, he had worked as a codebreaker for the National Security Agency, sitting in a quiet room, turning other nations' secrets into plain text. He thought in pattern. He thought in systems. And when he eventually turned that mind toward the markets, he founded a firm called Renaissance Technologies, and inside it, a fund called Medallion. I want to be careful not to oversell things in this story, because the truth needs no help. Medallion is, by most reckonings, the single most successful trading machine ever assembled. Closed to outsiders since the early 1990s, run almost entirely by physicists and mathematicians and code writers, it posted average returns before fees of something like 66% a year, year after year, for decades. There is nothing else quite like it in the history of finance. The machine worked. The machine made money the way a furnace makes heat. But here is where our pattern returns, because a furnace that good throws off an enormous amount of tax. And the way the machine made its money ran straight into two of the brightest, hardest lines in American finance. The first line is about time. If you buy something and sell it within a year, your profit is a short-term gain, taxed at the high, ordinary income rate in those years, something close to 35, even 40%. But if you hold that same thing for more than a year and a day, your profit becomes a long-term gain, taxed at the gentle rate, 15, maybe 20%. The law rewards patience. It taxes the patient investor lightly and the frantic trader heavily. The second line is about borrowing. Under a Federal Reserve rule called Regulation T, an ordinary customer can generally borrow only about half the cost of the stock they're buying, roughly 2 to 1. That is the leash. It exists so that no single account can build a tower of borrowed money tall enough to topple the rest. Now, hold those two lines in your mind. Patience taxed gently, borrowing kept at 2 to 1, and look at what Medallion actually did. It traded constantly. 30 million trades a year, on the order of 100,000 a day. It turned over almost its entire portfolio every few months. By every plain language definition that has ever existed, this was short-term trading, the most short-term trading on Earth. So how do you take the most frantic trading operation ever built and have it taxed like your grandmother's 20-year bond? You don't change the trading. You change the wrapper. Here is the device, and it is the same shape we have been meeting all night, only stitched in a bank's language instead of a friar's or a Mughal clerk's. Renaissance did not, on paper, own the stocks it was trading. Instead, two banks, Barclays, with a product it called Colt, and Deutsche Bank, with one it called Maps, wrote Medallion a contract. A single contract. It was called a basket option, and the idea was this: the bank would hold an account full of stocks, and Renaissance would hold an option on that whole basket. One option, one asset. And Renaissance's own algorithms would make every single trade inside the account, all 30 million of them, while the account sat, on paper, in the bank's name. Do you see what that one sheet of paper does? It does two things at once. First, the time trick. Renaissance held the option for more than a year, then exercised it. And because the law looked at the wrapper and not at what churned inside it, a full year of furious, 100,000 trades a day. buying and selling collapsed on paper into one long-held asset. A single, patient, long-term investment, taxed at the gentle rate. That is the humor of it, if you have the stomach for it. 30 million trades a year, reported to the government as a single long-term investment. And the second trick, the quieter one. Because the bank nominally held the account, the borrowing inside it wasn't a customer's margin loan. So Regulation T's 2-to-1 leash didn't apply. Renaissance put up roughly 10% of the cash. The bank lent the other 90%, which let the fund run leverage as high as 20-to-1, 10 times what the rule allows the rest of us. The fund put up 1/10, the bank put up the rest, and somehow the fund made every trade. The banks, for building and selling these wrappers, collected well over $1 billion in fees between them. Even the people writing the disguise were getting rich. For a while, it worked beautifully. It was defensible enough to run for years. It was not defensible enough to survive the United States Senate. In 2014, the Senate's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, chaired by Carl Levin of Michigan, with John McCain as its ranking member, hauled the whole structure into the daylight. Their report had a title only a government committee could love: Abuse of Structured Financial Products, Misusing Basket Options to Avoid Taxes and Leverage Limits. And the numbers inside it were staggering. The subcommittee found that across roughly 60 of these long-term basket options, the trading had thrown off something on the order of $34 billion in pre-tax profit. And the Senate staff estimated, and I want to be precise here, because these stories live or die on the small things they estimated, that between 2000 and 2013, Renaissance had avoided more than $6 billion in taxes by dressing short-term gains as long-term ones. A staff estimate, not a court's verdict. More than $6 billion by the Senate's own reckoning. That was the exposure. The reckoning came later, and it came quietly. No handcuffs, no perp walk, just the cold arithmetic of settling a bill. In September of 2021, Jim Simons, his colleague Robert Mercer, and other Renaissance executives agreed to pay the government up to roughly $7 billion back taxes, interest, and penalties to put the matter to rest. It was one of the largest tax settlements in the history of the United States. And I want to keep two numbers carefully apart, because it would be easy and wrong to blur them. The more than $6 billion avoided was the Senate's staff estimate, covering the years 2000 to 2013. The up to $7 billion settlement was a different figure, entirely a separate agreement, covering a different stretch of years, 2005 to 2015, and counting interest and penalties the first number never did. Two different measurements of two different things. And on top of all of it, Simons himself wrote a personal check for an additional $670 million. The loophole after that was effectively shut. Renaissance had used a single piece of paper to disguise what it truly owned, to make 100,000 trades a day look like one long, quiet afternoon of patience. But a century earlier, on a railroad called the Erie, 3 men had stumbled onto something even simpler. If a piece of paper is this powerful, why bother disguising anything at all? Why not just print it faster than your enemy can possibly buy it? In the 1860s, there was a clean and brutal way to take control of a public company. You bought it, quietly, share by share, in the open market, until you held a majority, and then it was yours. They called it a corner, and no one in America was better at it than Cornelius Vanderbilt. By then he was simply the Commodore, the aging, imperious titan who had built an empire first on steamships and then on railroads, and who was used, after a lifetime of it, to buying absolutely anything he wanted. He had already taken the New York Central and the Hudson lines, and in those years he set his eye on one more, the Erie Railway, a great trunk line running west out of New York. So he did the only thing he had ever needed to do. He told his brokers to buy every share of Erie that anyone offered. Sweep the market. Take it all. But the men running the Erie were not going to sell him a railroad. They were going to sell him paper. There were 3 of them, and you could not have invented a stranger trio. Daniel Drew, the Erie's treasurer, a grizzled old cattle drover turned speculator, a pious churchgoer on Sunday and a ruthless market manipulator the rest of the week. It's Drew, by the way, whom legend credits with the phrase, watered stock. The story goes that in his droving days he'd feed his cattle salt to make them gulp water and weigh heavier right before the sale. I'll be honest with you, the way these stories deserve, that cattle tale is almost certainly a fable. A great many of the colorful Drew anecdotes trace back to a single book published in 1910 that historians have since flagged as a fabrication. So enjoy the image, but hold it lightly. The man, at least, was real enough. Beside Drew stood the other 2. Jay Gould quiet, slight, cold-eyed, unreadable, the brain of the whole operation. And Jim Fisk, fat, loud, theatrical, dressed in waistcoats you could hear coming. Jubilee Jim, the showman and the brass. Together, the 3 of them ran the Erie, and together they held something Vanderbilt had not accounted for. New York law let the Erie's board issue convertible bonds, that is, debt that a bondholder could later swap for stock. A perfectly ordinary instrument. But there was no effective limit on how fast the board could authorize those bonds, and nothing in the law to stop the insiders from authorizing them and converting them to themselves. The number of shares of a railroad was supposed to be a fixed and finite thing. This one device made it, quietly, infinite. And that is the whole trap, in one sentence. Vanderbilt sat down to corner a finite thing. The men on the other side of the table knew there was no such thing as a finite share. In February of 1868, the trap closed. The Erie Board authorized $5 million in convertible bonds and instantly converted them into 50,000 brand new shares of Erie stock. I want to anchor that number because some retellings inflate it. 50,000 shares off of 5 million in bonds. Then they did it again. They were, in the most literal sense, running a printing press of stock certificates inside the Erie offices. Fisk is supposed to have joked that if this kept up, he'd own the whole railroad and a printing house besides. And out in the market, Vanderbilt's brokers kept buying. Of course they did, that was their order. Buy every share offered. So every time the Commodore's men purchased a block of Erie, the men running the Erie simply printed more and fed it to them. He was pouring the greatest fortune in America into a bucket with no bottom. The harder he bought, the more they printed. His money, the very thing that had never once failed him, had become his weakness. By the time the dust settled, Cornelius Vanderbilt had lost more than $7 million chasing a company he could never catch. But printing the shares was almost certainly illegal. And so the court stirred. A Tammany judge named George Barnard began issuing orders, injunctions, contempt citations to stop the scheme and, if it came to it, to jail the men behind it. Now, in those years, before there was any real federal securities law, before there was a Securities and Exchange Commission to call, an injunction was about the only weapon a court had. And an injunction has one great weakness of its own. It stops at the state line. So the three of them ran. On a March night in 1868, Drew, Gould, and Fisk gathered up the spoils, something like $7 million in cash and Erie certificates, and fled Manhattan across the Hudson River to Jersey City, beyond the reach of New York's courts entirely. They barricaded themselves into Taylor's Hotel, which the newspapers gleefully renamed Fort Taylor, and ringed it with hired guards. Fisk, who never met a crisis he couldn't turn into a performance, played at defending the castle guards on the docks, lookouts on the water, the whole theatrical apparatus of a siege. The richest man in America had been beaten by a printing press, and the men who beat him were now holed up in a New Jersey hotel, laughing with his money. They had won the battle, but an injunction could still be waiting for them the day they came home. So they decided to do something about the law itself. They decided to go and buy it. The man they sent was Gould. He traveled up to Albany, the New York state capital, carrying by the accounts that come down to us roughly $500,000 in greenbacks in a satchel. I'll say plainly that the exact figure is approximate. Contemporary reporting on a bag of bribe money was never going to be audited, but the substance is not in doubt. He went to the legislature with a great deal of cash, and he spent it. What he was buying was a law. Specifically, a bill that would reach back in time and declare that the Erie's flood of printed stock, the fraud that had just cost Vanderbilt $7 million, had been perfectly legal all along. And the corruption was so open, so brazen, that the committee looking into it earned a mocking nickname, the Moonshine Legislature. There's a story, told often, of a single state senator who took $75,000 from Vanderbilt's side to vote one way, and then $100,000 from Gould's side to vote the other. Whether that exact tale is true to the dollar, it captures the room precisely. The vote was simply for sale, and the men who'd printed the shares had more to spend. On the 13th of April, 1868, the so-called Erie Bill passed. The fraud was now the law. And the price of that law had one more line item, the most telling of all. Boss Tweed himself, William Tweed, the most notorious political boss of the age, the man who was Tammany Hall, was rewarded for delivering Albany by being made a director of the Erie Railway. The corruption didn't just win. It took a seat on the board. In the end, Vanderbilt, who hated nothing in this world more than losing, cut his losses. A settlement was reached. The ring quietly bought back much of his Erie stock and made him roughly whole, recovering perhaps $1 million of what he'd dropped. The Commodore, for the first and only time in his life, walked away beaten. And the loophole, it did eventually close. The scandal helped drive the slow tightening of the rules against printing stock out of nothing, the anti-overissue laws, and, decades later, the federal securities regulation we live under now, the Securities and Exchange Commission, born in 1934. But notice when that monument was built. Long after. 60-some years after 3 men ran a printing press against a billionaire and then bought a legislature to bless it. The reckoning came afterward. It always comes afterward. That is the whole shape of the thing. Because step back, now, from the satchel of greenbacks and the man on the Erie's board, and look at the full sweep of what we've sat with tonight. Every fortune in this long night lived in the very same place, the gap between what the law said and what the law could actually stop. And the Erie ring did only the most naked version of what all of them did. When the gap wasn't wide enough, they widened it. When the rule was inconvenient, they wrote a new one. Which leaves one last question worth sitting with in the dark. So, 9 fortunes. 9 quiet gaps in the rules. And before you drift off, I want to gather what they share, not as a lesson, because I've no interest in telling you how to live, but as an observation, a shape that keeps recurring across 2,000 years. In the dark. The first thing is this: the fortune almost always lives in the seam between 2 systems, where one set of rules ends and the next has not yet begun. A city with no fire service. A ship between 2 flags. A woman between 2 states. A sacred law with a commercial side door. The money pools, every time, in the gap. The second thing is harder to sit with. Almost none of it was a crime. Legal, at the time, was the engine of nearly every fortune we touched. Society wrote the rule afterward, once the wealth was already made. The Sherman Act, the Crown taking India, the closing of the basket option, the Erie reforms, monuments, everyone, raised long after the money had left the building. Third, the disguise. The trick, over and over, was to make one thing legally look like another. Interest dressed as an exchange. A paycheck dressed as a capital gain. A company dressed as a charity. A tax office dressed as a trading firm. A resident dressed as a stranger to every state. The law, it turns out, tests the paperwork, not the truth underneath it. Fourth, permission itself was often the moat. A license, a charter, a concession, a secret rebate. The single door no one else was allowed through. It's there in that barrel from the cold open, the one whose owner paid 80 cents to ship his own oil, never knowing 40 of them went to the rival, crushing him. He wasn't beaten by a better product. He was beaten by who was allowed to ship cheaply and who wasn't. And fifth, the strangest of all, the wrapper recurs across the millennia. The trust, the foundation, the basket option, the bill of exchange, all the same object in different clothes, a legal container that transforms whatever you put inside it. Crassus's no public service exists, and no jurisdiction claims this ship are, in the end, the same sentence. The wrapper never really goes away. It just changes hands. Sixth, and underneath all the rest, every person we met tonight read the world as a system. Not a set of commandments to obey, but a machine to be understood. They had nerve, and timing, and a tolerance for being first, and for being hated for it. That's the lens. That's all of it. And the seventh, the quietest, the fortune outlives the loophole. The gap gets closed. The wealth remains. Now, let me leave you with one opinion, since you stayed this long, and then I'll let you go. Of everyone we sat with tonight, I think it was Rockefeller who understood the pattern most completely. He didn't merely find a gap and slip through it. He built a wrapper, that quiet little word, trust, that the law of the United States could not see through for 30 years. While the country argued about him, he simply could not be found inside his own creation. That's mastery of a different order. But I'd be the first to admit it's a close thing, and I suspect a good number of you will disagree, and I'd genuinely like to hear it. Some of you will make the case for the quiet Qing merchant who held the only door into an empire and ended up the banker to half the West. Others for the woman who beat 2 state treasuries for an entire lifetime by the simple, stubborn refusal to be found anywhere at all. Tell me who you'd choose. I read them. And here, finally, is the thought I'd ask you to carry down into sleep. Every age believes it has finally closed the gaps. Every age believes the rules are airtight now, the seams all sewn, the loopholes all found and shut. And every age is wrong. Somewhere, even now, tonight, while the world sleeps, someone is reading the rules more carefully than the rest of us, and finding the door no one else can see. Since you made it this far, I'm glad you enjoyed the episode. If you would like to continue listening to episodes with similar themes, I linked them in the description below. You will also find a playlist of our most popular videos. Sleep now, midnight magnates, and wake up at